Laura Calvag, and I am a freelance web designer, developer-y kind of person. I do design and lots of things around it, but that is all you need to know about me. So, I'm thinking that responsive web design is the natural evolution of web design. We've started off as designers, designing for the printed book, then designing for the desktop, and now starting to design for multiple devices and things like that. And we're using this amazing platform, the web, and we get to work with all these different devices. The only problem is that the web is an endless publishing platform, but all these devices are starting to restrict us and limit us because we're trying to distribute across so many different devices, trying to make our websites work in so many different ways. It's becoming a bit of a struggle. We've always known that the web needs to be flexible. We've always known that people have different screen sizes. This is why we used to design 800 by 600 web pages, and we sort of all upped it to 1024 by 768. And a lot of people have been adopting the fluid sort of web design for a very long time. So people have known about it for ages. And I think that it's inevitable that we actually realise that we need to stop being restricted by these particular screen sizes. We know that we need to be flexible, and we need to stop thinking about these averages, this many users use this, and this many users use that. We need to actually start thinking about proper fluidity and proper movement. So a little bit about my talk. I think the technical side of responsive web design, as exciting and awesome as it is, and Peter's talk is going to be amazing, and I'm not in any way slacking it off, but I think that we've, as designers, we're often push our creative side to the back of our mind, and we concentrate far too much on the development aspect because that's the thing that's the difficult thing and stuff like that. But actually, we've stopped thinking about how do we actually design for responsive design? What's the difference? And how does all this flexibility make a difference to how our design needs to be? And so this talk is going to be completely free and completely ignorant of anything technical, any CSS and HTML, stuff like that. I might mention it like once. So don't expect any code or anything coming up on here. And also, my slides are going to be fairly interesting. It's going to be a bit like a cross between Pictionary and catchphrase. So it's fairly badly drawn, and the catchphrase element will be that sometimes they'll make sense, sometimes they might have just made sense to me, but I'm hoping these are kind of visual cues. So hopefully that'll help you remember a bit. So quickly, just before I start, so I've got a rough idea of who I'm talking to. How many people here are designers? And developers? And designer developers? And other, like writers, researchers, project managers, etc.? Yeah, one. Hardcore. Okay. So my talk is, as I said, it's completely deliberately ignorant of technical difficulties. So you might need to be designers who need to code. I'm definitely not denying that, and I completely agree that I think designers mostly need to be able to write HTML and CSS. And the problem is that I don't think that it's actually necessarily knowing the code can be helpful during the design process, because whilst you need to know the constraints, sometimes the constraints constrain you too much, and it stops you from being creative. Having to think about the CSS and the HTML, it might stop making you do the most creative and fun things that you want to do. It's about trying to forget that, trying to actually think about the content and the website and how we actually want to show it, rather than worrying too much about the technical difficulties too early on. We need to be optimistic and idealistic about it. We need to forget about IE and all that nonsense. So the first step in your project, when you come to your proposal and things like that, you need to think about whether you're going to use responsive design or not. I think if you're going to sell responsive design, you really need to be sold on responsive design yourself. You're not going to propose to a client that you use it if you're not sure that you're going to use it yourself. So why bother? A lot of people say this on Twitter all the time. What's the point? Why do we need to learn something new? Well, it is the easiest, and by easiest I mean the cheapest and the quickest and requires the fewest skills, way to accommodate a large group of users on as many devices as possible for a low budget. And I mean, if you think about the amount of people that are incrementally using all these different devices to access the web, you'd probably be a bit daft to not think about optimizing for these users. All of your websites, the success depends on users being able to use them as easily as possible, be able to read your content and things like that. there is no situation where optimizing it isn't going to help. Also, you're going to be more future friendly. The web is going to be around for a long time. It's probably going to outlive most apps, most different platforms and things like that. It's already been around for quite a long time. So if you design your website so that it can be on the web and is like agnostic of devices, then your website is more likely to be around for a long time. And this is what I mean by the device agnostic. If your website can exist on any device that has a web browser, and so many devices now that are coming out that probably don't even need a web browser, yet they've still got a web browser, you're not restricted by a platform. So that's why your website will live on. And one of the main reasons why I do responsive design is I think it's fun. I think it's good to have a challenge. We didn't join this industry to sit and be bored and do the same things day in, day out. Most of us join this industry because we like learning, we like doing new things, we like trying new stuff. So why not just jump on the bandwagon, as much of a bandwagon as it might be, and give it a go? And so the keywords and all these sort of things that come up, flexible, responsive, adaptive, so these words that people throw about, they think they're cool if they say a particular one and stuff like that. But I think it's important to vaguely understand what people mean, the differences between these keywords. So responsive design. This is the one that was coined by Ethan Marcotte. It might have been coined by someone else beforehand, but he put it in a book. And I don't know, that seems to be a definition of like things that are so. If you put it in a book, then it is so. And so some people say responsive is a catch-all term for websites that fluidly change to respond to the screen it's displayed on. But Ethan Marcotte defines it as being three different things. It has a fluid grid. See, I don't know if you can actually guess this. This is the bit where it's like catchphrase. Can you guess that that's a fluid grid? My bottle of fluid responsiveness. Flexible images and uses media queries. See, that's a tiny bit of CSS that I sneaked in there. And the idea behind it is that your website is acting in response to the screen. And then on the other hand, we have adaptive sites, which people have been doing for quite a while. I think adaptive was the previous approach for mobile web. And this is often described as a branch of responsive web design, but it's an alternative to sort of infinitely fluid responsive design. So adaptive is defined as being designed for controlled adaptation. It is like multiple versions of a design for specific breakpoints. It changes to suit the device. It's very much more heavily based around breakpoints. To be honest, I don't care. And either of those, it doesn't really matter when you're designing. Does it make much difference? Probably not. I like to just call it all flexible. So I like to have flexible websites. And I think personally I prefer responsive designs because I think that they're probably a bit more future friendly because if you're designing adaptive sites, you're designing to fixed breakpoints and they might change in the future. So I think that the flexible responsive side is probably the way forward, but that's all your personal choice. And one of the things that I think is also really important to understand when you're designing for this is that your design is reactive rather than responsive. It's about building in that extra flexibility that will see what the device is throwing at it and respond accordingly. It's reacting accordingly. It's not just scaling from size to size. It's going, this is what the conditions are, this is what I'm going to do. But it doesn't necessarily mean mobile. I think a lot of people think about responsive design and they think I have to do it in mobile. And Natty Down, she's a very cool lady, and she said, well, sometimes you can have a flexible, responsive web design and a mobile app. There's nothing stopping you. I mean, you're covering a broader range of devices that way, and you get a personalised experience if you've got loads of users on iPhone or something like that. So you don't need to think that responsive web design exclusively means including mobile. Because if you think about it, the iPhone, whilst we might design these sites, these tiny little thin sites for the iPhone, the web browser, Mobile Safari, was actually designed to take full sites. It was designed for any site with web standards will render perfectly fine. You can use it perfectly fine. You can zoom in and move about, and it's no problem. So it's more about your users, your content. It doesn't really matter if your site isn't like a tiny thin column. As the very clever Mark Bolton said, is actually this is making our process evolve so that we as designers are more about principles and goals. We're helping people with design strategies. We're not just doing pretty comps. We're not just drawing pretty pictures of websites. We're actually starting to tell people this is why you should design it like that. Why is something that a lot of designers seem to miss out. They're just kind of, well, I know it because I'm a designer and I say that red goes. And we don't want to be like that. We want to be the designers with the ideas, the strategists. We want to help. We want our designs to help people go somewhere. We don't just want to be decorators. So once you've got an idea that you want to use responsive design, you want to start talking about it with the client. As a general rule, how do we sell it to our clients? And one of the ways is managing client expectations. That can be quite tricky because clients have all different ideas about how things should look on different devices. And the important thing is that you just keep communication open and you bear their thoughts in mind. And when I say clients, because I'm a freelancer, I tend to talk a lot in terms of clients, but I mean like, I don't know, bosses, project managers, whoever has the last word. So you want to let them know who you're designing for. This is why it's relevant. This is why we need to support all of these different devices. These are the devices that we're aiming for it to be really awesome on. I mean, it could work on any device, but these are the ones that we think would be really valuable. And how you're going to do it, sort of, will you be adaptive? Will you be responsive? Will you use fancy server-side code and things like that? It is difficult talking to clients about these things, and there are other options. And I think even before you get to that point, you need to think, why am I doing it? You need to sort of check yourself and meditate a while and go, why am I doing responsive web design? Am I doing it because it's trendy? Am I doing it because it's shiny? Am I putting reflections on all my images because Apple have done it and everyone else has done it and Web 2.0 is really cool? Because if you're doing it that way, well then you may as well not bother. I mean, you might impress your friends, but you're going to spend a long time doing a project that's not going to be very helpful. You're just going to be doing it to look cool and be one of the gang. So then you need to check the client and the project. Is the responsive design really appropriate for them? Does the existing site, if there is one, get many users on a variety of devices? Checking your analytics and things like that is really helpful. But beware when you're doing this of making assumptions. People can assume, oh, there's loads of people accessing it on a mobile device, so they must be sort of on the road, things like that. You can be really careful, never make assumptions about anything at all. You need to check your analytics, do as much research as you can, and then use a test and use a test and use a test and use a test. Then there is this other option when approaching clients, and that's don't tell them anything. So Anna Debenham, she says that in her mind, it's like accessibility. You do it anyway to a site. You should consider accessibility and make your site work really well. And I hope that most people would do that. But some projects need a bit more attention to the accessibility. And that could be the same with responsive web design. You could think, well, actually, so many devices in the world today. Let's always, as a standard, design all our sites as flexible, responsive websites. And only tell the client if they ask. I've actually done that on one project and that I had last year. And it was a client that they were selling an iPhone app. So I thought, well, actually, chances are they're going to get a lot of visits to an iPhone. So I may as well, not going to take me much longer, make it work on iPhone. So when you get started on your project and you've got the client's approval and you're getting into responsive, it's just like any other design project. It's about immersing yourself fully in the content. And I think with flexible web design, you can't fall back on decorative elements. You've got to really know what your content is, know about how you're going to display it, know about how you're going to represent it. You might be given the content by your client, and you might have to help show them the way. And this, I think you've got to consider that this could be part of the plan. You can't always go, right, well, once I've been given the content, then I'll do the design, which is a kind of a rule that I started bringing on myself because I didn't want to design without content. But actually sometimes you've got to give the client a push. You've got to help them get the structure that will be good for their users. And this is the kind of thing that you want to be doing at the research and planning stages, making sure you get that done, get that content so you really know what you're designing for. Now here I jump straight into the design and development phase because when you're planning, your planning actually rapidly becomes kind of designing. You're sort of doing lo-fi wireframe concepts and things like that, and that is designing. It's just lo-fi designing. And often the development gets thrown in as well because you're checking if something will work and if something will flow right in the browser and stuff like that. So I think process, I mean, it goes out the window to a degree. There isn't a strict order anymore. And so then we come to the design considerations. What are these big things that we need to think about when we're designing for the flexible web? Small screens, and they're quite fun because they're so different and we're not used to them. And this is what I was saying before about whatever you do not fall for the users on the move cliche. Any device can be used at any time. There are varying studies saying that people will sit at home on Wi-Fi watching TV and surfing the web. So they've got perfectly good connections, so you don't need to worry about that. They're not in a particular hurry, so you don't need to worry about that. In the same way, you might be someone sitting there furiously trying to get something to work, sitting on crappy coffee shop 3G signal on your full-on MacBook Pro. So the screen size doesn't necessarily mean different connection speeds and things like that. You've got to bear that in mind. Any device can be used at any time. Though there are a few things that you could probably make basic assumptions about, things like touch screens. I mean, you've got to bear them in mind. And things like you need to have very big touch points to make it easy to tap and browse about, not have too many elements crammed next to each other. And also think about the fact that when someone's using their phone and they're touching it, their hand is going to be covering the majority of your site. So it's just little things like that. Think about the different ways that people interact with their sites. There's often people now talk about TVs, which I try to avoid thinking about websites on TVs because I think it would be horrible. But it's remote controls. How's someone going to browse your site using a remote control? So all these things, they all sort of build up. And they're all sort of small screen consideration. And hover. I mean, you can't use hover interactions on a touch screen because when you try hovering, it doesn't work. It's not going to pick anything up. And so don't hide anything behind hover navigation, things like that, which I don't know why people would do that anyway, because I think that would be fairly bad usability. So rather than designing for the unknown, the connection speed, the size, the sort of the shape of the device, what it is, whether it's touchscreen, things like that, design for the known. And what do we know here? We can very easily know what the screen width is. So that's a safe enough thing, always design around the screen width. It's easy enough to optimize for what you exactly know. Another thing you could think about when you're designing for the screen width is you've got to think about how far away the device is going to be for the user. So if it's a small screen width, then chances are the device is nearer because you've got to be able to read it, so it's going to be fairly close to you. Whereas if it's larger, it's probably going to be quite far away from you. If any of you use an iMac, you don't sit that close to your iMac because that's a whopping great big screen, isn't it? And I mean, if you're sitting like that against an iMac, you probably need glasses. There you go. So content, it should be arranged accordingly to the size of the screen. It's much easier to browse a lot of content on a large screen. I think that's fairly obvious. And small screen users are likely to appreciate more navigation to help them get about and sort of understand your content, because that's a lot of scrolling, going down like that with a tiny little viewport with all that text. Now, I get bored of just going like this, trying to find something, and I'm completely guilty of designing sites like that on mobile as well. You think, oh, it'll load, that will be fine, but you're trying to get to the bottom, it drives you mad. And this is why when you're designing, thinking about the content hierarchy is so important, and this is why you need the content, because on small screens, you want to see the most important information first. So you want to choose what's your king of content and the order in which, how important it is, and then you can arrange it accordingly on screen so that when you've got a big screen, you can have that king of content right at the top and then arrange the other stuff underneath. Whereas when you're on a small screen, you've got that king of content right at the top. And that's quite a big thing, branding versus navigation. Which do you have at the top of a small screen? I think they are the two things that are most important when you arrive on a site on such a small screen, is where you are. You want someone to know, I mean, let alone what page you're on, but whose site is this? So that's the branding part, and also which way to go next, so your navigation. And they're both they are both important. And I would generally say that I'd probably put the branding at the top, because knowing where you are is quite important. If you came off Twitter or somewhere like that, you might not necessarily know. And branding is important. People want to know who they're browsing with. You want them to know who they're browsing with. And then navigation. Navigation, I mean, you can have a skip link to the bottom or a link at the top and things like that. And that's where Brad Frost's, I don't know why it's so far away, but that's why Brad Frost's site is really good. He's listed about 6 different responsive navigation patterns, all the different ways of doing them. They've all got pros and cons and long lists of cons, and it's mostly choosing the best of the 6 evils, but it still is the best that we've got at the moment. Another thing that people are very guilty of when they're thinking about small screen design is, what do you throw away? And if you're thinking that, you're thinking wrong, because if you're considering throwing this content away for small screen, why are you even using it in the first place? I mean, nothing's going to frustrate a user more than if they're used to viewing your site on a big screen, and then they go to your small screen there and happen to just be on mobile at some point, and they can't find what they're looking for because you've taken it away, because you thought, oh, they're on small screen, they won't care about that. So just don't do that. If you're cluttering your content, take it out or put it somewhere else. Just don't take away things and where people expect them to be, because you're only going to frustrate people doing that. But what I do think you can get rid of is excess decorative elements. And I'm a maximalist designer. I like sticking all kinds of crap in there. I like textures, I like nice patterns, I like loads of different layering colours and things like that. And I really have to rein myself in when I'm doing this kind of design, because you can see very clearly, if you put loads of crap around the outsides of your text and your images and things like that, you are going to make it harder to read. You are going to obscure the content, which is really what it's about. It's not about showing off your fancy designer skills, how good you are at Photoshop. It is about the content. And so I think we kind of need to drop a bit of ego and embrace the nice, clean, modern design styles. The thing with larger screens is that you've got so much space, it's a luxury. So the design isn't so much a problem. I mean, most of us are fairly in tune with designing for desktop-sized screens and things like that. But what we've got to try and think about, one of the big challenges on the larger screens, is thinking about how our large screens relate to our smaller screens. So it's about creating a unified design. You want your site to feel like it's the same site across the screens. You don't want it to be so dramatically different. So it's about thinking, what do you make the same on your sites, and what do you make different across the different screens? So what will unify them, and what will differentiate them? And I think the best way of doing this is through a design system. I think this is my winner for obscure slide, because I mean, I was like, system? What on earth do I do when I say system? Solar system. I thought a solar system would be a bit of fun. And design systems might sound like very highly involved, sort of nerdy designer kind of things to do, but actually we kind of do this already in our heads. When we're designing, we think, oh, well, I'm making this header this colour, so all the other headers will be that colour. We kind of keep it in our minds, but we never actually formalise it or put it on paper. So in design systems, when we're talking about the things that unify our designs, I say that the big one that can really help is colour. So you'll probably have a brand colour, maybe a couple of brand colours. A few brand colours are better, because a few brand colours will separate your red site from another red site, whereas a few different ones, your colour palette will be a lot more sophisticated and will separate it. And then a colour is an instant way for you to tell when someone looks at your website, be it on a very small screen or a very large screen, these are the same sites, because they got the same colours. And of course the biggie is typography. With so much content, and we've got text, and we're throwing away all those excess decorative elements, and we're just down to the lovely clean content. Typography is really important, and you can use it to create a consistent unity across your designs, because you're using the same font family. So now we can use nice fonts and things like that. We can use the same font on every design, and that will create your brand feeling. And also with the font size and the line height, if you keep those consistent, so I don't mean the same font size as each screen, but the ratio between them, the proportions between the font size and the line height, and the proportions between the font size for your header and the font size for your paragraph text. If you keep those consistent, you're creating a system, a feel, that will echo across your different designs and will make you feel like it's the same site. It's all part of your design system. So the thing that people mostly think about when they think about design systems is the modules of content and how you'll use those and reuse them across the site. So you might pick how you have a paragraph heading with paragraph text, and how you'd have your paragraph heading with your paragraph text relates to your standard list heading with your list text. And it's about planning these individual elements is very important, and how they'll work across your site, but also planning how they'll work in relation to each other is important part of your style guide. It's working out how all these elements will work together. So it's very easy to think about designs in little chunks, but it's about trying to work out how it will work as a whole in your system. And there are two particularly good resources for this. There's Style Guide Approach, which Paul Lloyd's been going on about recently. And he's really cool. He's got a really cool style guide, like a default one on his own site, that has a list of all these different HTML elements and how he would style them across his site. And the other one is Dan Cederholm's Pairs library, which is a pattern library, which is a similar idea. They're both different types of design systems. So I recommend those. That Pairs, it is a URL. It's not quite obvious that it's just sort of 5 letters, but yeah, that's a URL. And it's all about creating these reusable elements that have the same meaning across the site, so it'll help users to understand what your content's about, because you're echoing this meaning, you're creating a language that they'll understand. So you could create your style guide based on HTML. A lot of people do this, and they'll have a list of all the different HTML elements, and this is how I'll style that HTML element. But I think that often thinking in HTML and CSS isn't conducive to creativity. It's not going to make you think about different ways that the elements relate to each other and different things about text. You might fall into the default browser style kind of category. We want to try and escape this technical stuff if we want to exploit the creative elements of it. And then there's lorem ipsum. I don't know if anyone uses this already, but I really hope you don't, because the most important part of design is what you're designing for. If you're designing for lorem ipsum, then I'm not really sure what you're designing your website for. It's about understanding the content, displaying the content, representing your content. So lorem ipsum is just guessing. It's guessing design. So you can't use lorem ipsum with design systems, because it would be a collection of just arbitrary stuff. So yeah, so that one. When you're designing flexibility, we want this unity through the colour and the typography and things like that, so we've got that brand-like similarities going on, and this consistent visual language. But we also need to differentiate through layout, because obviously that's the difference between our different screen sizes, is our different layouts. Grid systems are a very big part of this, and grid systems just give you a bit of structure that can be the difference between having a nicely planned out page and something that's like content just spat out onto the page. But don't fall into the, oh god, I've got to use a 3-column grid on my 320 pixel wide screen because I do on my 960 pixel wide thing. If you think about it harmoniously, like 3 columns go down very nicely easily into one. But you can use these patterns and these proportions so that your design still feels similar. So if you're using a 6-column grid, you can reduce it down to a 3-column grid. You're using that rule of thirds, the almost golden section, and things like that. You're echoing it. And the same with a 4-column grid. If you're going with symmetry, just shorten it down to a 2-column grid. So you've got that same feel, and you're still using a grid, but you're not just being a slave to the grid. Design is about knowing the rules, and when you're changing layouts like this, that's the one time where you want to break the rules in a good way. And on the subject of breaking, breakpoints are quite contentious, because people have for a long time been talking about breakpoints based on different device widths, which obviously if you're going for an adaptive approach is very sensible. But if you want your site to be future-friendly and truly responsive to loads of different devices, whatever devices come out in the future, doing it to devices probably isn't a good idea, because those devices will go away, you'll have new ones, and then your sizes will be completely wrong. So another thing that's been coming about recently, people have been talking about basing your breakpoints around your content. So it's about taking and optimizing your content and showing it at its best, really. If you think about it, it's about what do you know and what do you not know. You don't know what devices people are browsing your website with, so why design for that? You do know what your content looks like, so design for that. So images is quite a straightforward thing, but if you want to have really nice big images and you want people to be able to see as much of them as possible, you'll base your breakpoints around those images, so where they look the best. And if you're using tables, which is, I think it's quite a hard thing to design for responsively, you'll want to try and put the breakpoints at points that will make your table still easy to read and easy to digest. And as a side point, I know it's quite an obscure drawing, but that one on the far right there, one of the things that I found with tables recently, quite a good way of breaking down a table for a small screen is breaking it into individual items. So almost like a list, and a list of the different items in your table, and then having them with all their different properties, like top trump cards or something like that. Rather than comparing them in a table, you've got the cards in front of you, and that's quite a nice way of breaking up tables. Then flexibility, and this is the most important thing. So one of the great ways of getting the flexibility into your design is you can use major and minor breakpoints. So you can have all these big breakpoints that say this is a massive screen, this is a tiny screen, things like that. But you can use your minor breakpoints in between to keep it neat and tidy. So things like line lengths and stuff like that, if you want your content to be readable. And if you've got a really big screen, you don't want to be reading sort of, I don't know, maybe 100 words along a screen. I mean, you're going to be there like going like this, it's going to be really difficult to concentrate. So using minor breakpoints can really help because readability can change so quickly from just the slightest change in screen width. That's also something that's advocated by Brian and Stephanie Rieger. They go on about major and minor breakpoints a lot, and I'll recommend reading from them if you're interested in that. So process. We are moving away from this more print-based workflow of mock-up, feedback, iterate, produce it. And for a while we have been sort of mocking up stuff and making it and things like that at the same time and then getting feedback. And this is more of a continuation of that. We do need to mock up and produce at the same time, so we have an idea of, because it's like live mock-ups and things like that, and getting the feedback to help feed our live mock-ups. And going back around, it's not about hiding your content and your design away from people and then suddenly going, ta-da, don't you like it? And then going, no, and you've wasted loads of time. And I mean, part of the problem with this design process is that we haven't got the best tools for the job. So what we want is a really nice hammer and a nice paintbrush. What we've really got is the big old mallet of browser that will just smack. You can get everything down there, and yeah, it works, and that's how the content flows and things like that. And you've got this tiny little paintbrush where you can do all the pretty little detail in Photoshop. And we haven't really got something two things that work together well enough yet to design well. But the problem is that how do we design? What do we design in? What tools do we use when we're designing responsively? Because nothing shows the flow of the content better than the browser. That's the only way that's going to show the realistic flow of the content. And the problem with working in the browser is that how do we stay creative? I mean, I don't know about you, if I design in a browser, I end up with all my content in boxes with borders, because that's what the browser does really well. And that's what I think, CSS boxes. So part of using the Photoshop is, and other fireworks and all these other tools, maybe even wireframes and sketches, it's about exploring, it's about the journey that you go on. That's what design's about. That's how you feed these things into your brains with all these different sketches and you bring everything together. So whilst I think designing in the browser can be useful, and you probably do need to do it at a point, you can't worry about sticking to that during the design process. There are loads of militants out there that will go, if you're designing responsive design, you must be designing in the browser. You can't do any mock-ups. I say forget them, because it's about what makes you creative, and it's about what you enjoy and what actually makes your design work. Right? There's a great talk at New Adventures. Robbie Manson said, designing in the browser doesn't necessarily foster creativity. If you are awesome at CSS and you can you design in your mind and just put it out into HTML and CSS, then you're amazing, and I have a lot of respect for you, and that's great. But not everyone's like that. And part of our process, part of our maturity as an industry is about understanding that we're not all the same. We don't all design the same. We don't all have the same process. We've got to embrace that and stop sort of nitpicking at each other for not doing the same as us. And another thing that people say is that mobile first. Well, you've got to develop mobile first, you've got to design mobile first, and things like this. And I think that that's not necessarily true either. And I quite like designing desktop first, or big screens first. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I don't have in my mind the mobile screen as I'm designing for larger screens. And the other way around also applies. If you're designing a mobile thing, you might be thinking, how will this work as you're designing it? I mean, you don't lock yourself down into, right, I'm in full screen mode now, I will only design for large screens. And you don't lock yourself into small screen mode, so it's not worth thinking about, like worrying about which, just do which comes first. Do which comes easiest to you, which inspires you the most. Or even which presents you with the most problems. That might be quite a good option. Start with the problems that you need to solve. And when you're designing these graphics and things like that, it's quite nice to work with mock-ups side by side. So you can help get that unified feel. You can see how everything's going to feel across the different screen sizes. And then you fall into the trap of, do I create 1 million mock-ups for every different breakpoint? And no, I mean, you'd be quite mad to do this. I think that fixed mock-ups can work really well if you're showing different ways that your design system can be interpreted at particular breakpoints. So it's almost like examples or snapshots. This is how my design system's going to work. So maybe, I think if you start getting to more than 3 or 4 different size mock-ups, then you're probably falling into a black hole of doom. But otherwise, I think that some fixed mock-ups are safe. If you design well in fixed mock-ups, then do it. I think as Mark Bolton said, and I talk about Mark Bolton a lot because he's got some really good ideas about responsive design, trying to create a mock-up for every breakpoint is shoehorning a fixed width process into your responsive web design. You don't want to just stick with the processes we've been doing forever. This responsive stuff is really new, and we need new processes and things like that. We need to try new stuff. Let's not worry about trying to stick with what we always did. And then here's the bad news. There is no best process anyway. I mean, I'm not going to come here and tell you this is the magic bullet for how to design for responsive web. I think that the magic bullet is understanding that everyone's different, understanding that we all are creative in different ways, and that we will do it our own way, in our own time. And some people will find some really cool tools for doing it, and we need to follow them. But you don't need to worry about doing it right, because there is no right way. An important part, going back to them, is these clients, bosses, people. And in our process, we need to make sure that we're continually communicating with them. It is a big problem if you do a lot of work and you design 1 million mock-ups and things like that, and then you take it to the client and they hate it and they don't understand why you're doing it this size and stuff like that. Iterating rapidly with your clients, with your co-workers, if you're a designer doing it with a developer and things like that, is so important to just opening up our process and making sure we're not wasting time. And along with iterating with the feedback, we need to test our designs. I mean, people talk about going and browser testing and things like that, but how often do you test your design before it's actually developed? So one of the great options I have for this is Dropbox. And if you use I don't know if it works on other mobile devices, I'm sure it probably does, but I have an iPhone, and I've got the Dropbox app. And if I design a mock-up, the right size, and then I put it into Dropbox as a PNG image, if you then open it up full screen in the Dropbox app, and it's like it's an app on your phone or a site on your phone, and it's great. So you might not be able to interact with it, it might still be static, but you can see, will my finger clumsily tap that other link? Will I be able to read the text? Do the colours look funny in this light? Do I need to make them stronger and easier to read, like higher contrast? So I think that's another thing, that you need to ensure that you're testing your designs, and obviously user testing on people, that's all helpful, like passing it on to someone. Would you use this if this was on your phone? And I mean, I'm not very good at user testing, but that's would I use this or not on your phone? But is not just thinking about it in terms of browser testing, not just thinking about it in terms of does this work on this device. It's more about thinking about, is this design optimized for it? Will this design be enjoyable to use? And then, coming towards the end of my talk, one of my pet peeves is speed. All these people going on, why are you doing responsive web design? It's not fast enough. It's going to take you so much longer. Oh, soon our process will be so good that it will take as quick as it was before. And I think this is rubbish. Like, with responsive and flexible design, you're planning so much. You're trying to take so many different points into account. You can't expect it to take less time. You can't expect it to take the same amount of time. You're producing something that's so much bigger, does so much more, and in theory should be so much better. Why would you think it would take an equal amount of time? And I think we need to try and stamp on this one and get rid of it, because I think it's a really daft way of thinking. And so then on to my final point. One of the things we need to do is, as we're developing this new process, is continue evaluating our design after we're done. See how effective it is, because we are pioneering this sort of way of designing. We need to see what other people think. We don't just need to see it because our egos need a bit of rubbing. We want to check what's effective and what's not, and not be scared of finding that we have weaknesses, that we failed. Not hide away and go, well, it's done, I'm not thinking about it anymore. We need to take what we did right and adopt it and carry on, and we need to promote it to other people who aren't really sure, and then see what our failures are, maybe share our failures with other people, and help everyone understand, like, this is how our process will be from now. This is the things that work and the things that don't work. And I think it's very easy when you're doing new things to be a bit scared of sharing it, and I think it's very important to admit when you're wrong and say, look, this site I designed for, what do you think, Future Insights Live or Future Web Design is a bit dodgy in places on mobile, and I would welcome any criticism, because I think that you need that to learn as a designer. You need to forget the ego and help yourself to grow. Anyway, I didn't go on too long for you, but that's me, and I'm at Laura Calbag on Twitter. If anyone wants to talk, I would very much appreciate it. Thank you.